ma'am. I need to see your papers, proof of status, now.
I'm a U.S. citizen. Head nurse at Mercy General. I'm waiting for the bus.
Not a debate. ID or you're going in cuffs for obstruction.
Then say it on camera. You're arresting an American nurse for standing at a bus stop.
The dashcam mounted on the dashboard of the unmarked government SUV captured the entire scene in high definition, recording the crisp morning air and the silence of the suburban street before the chaos began. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of morning that feels crisp and full of purpose. Officer Kyle Vance, 29 years old and eager to make a name for himself within the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, had absolutely no idea that the woman he was eyeing through his windshield was not a person of interest, but a pillar of the community. Sarah Jenkins, 54, was standing at the bus stop, just as she had for the past 15 years. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hiding. She was the head nurse of the trauma unit at Mercy General Hospital, a woman who had managed mass casualty events and trained hundreds of nurses. She was a fourth-generation American born in Cleveland, Ohio, to a father who was a chaotic Korean War veteran and a mother who taught civics. Sarah was dressed in her navy blue scrubs, a heavy cardigan against the chill, and her hospital ID clipped prominently to her chest. She was checking her watch, calculating the minutes until the number 42 bus would arrive to take her to a shift where 3 critical patients were waiting for her specific care. Kyle Vance saw none of that history. He didn't see the fatigue of a woman who had worked a double shift 2 days prior. He didn't see a citizen. He saw a quota. He saw a black woman standing alone at a bus stop in a neighborhood that had seen a recent influx of undocumented laborers, and he decided, based on nothing but his own ambition and bias, that she didn't belong. Vance had been on the task force for 18 months. He was aggressive, often reprimanded for his tone, but praised for his numbers. He parked his SUV illegally in the red zone, the tires crunching against the curb, and stepped out. He adjusted his tactical vest, checked the placement of his weapon not drawn but ready, and approached the bus stop with a swagger that betrayed his youth and his arrogance. Sarah heard the heavy boots on the pavement and turned her head slightly. She saw the uniform, the bold police patch that ICE agents often wear to project authority, and the aggressive stance. She didn't flinch. She had raised 3 sons in America. She knew exactly how to stand when law enforcement approached. She kept her hands visible, clasping her tote bag loosely. She expected him to walk past her, perhaps to the convenience store on the corner. Instead, Vance stopped 3 feet in front of her, blocking her view of the street. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough to startle a few pigeons nearby. "I need to see your papers regarding your status in the United States." Sarah stared at him. The question was so absurd, so blatantly unconstitutional given the context that she blinked. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm, the voice she used to soothe panicked relatives in the ER. "I am waiting for the bus to go to work. I'm a nurse." Vance smirked a dismissal that would later be played on loop for a federal jury. "I didn't ask for your job history. I asked for proof of citizenship or legal residency. We're conducting an enforcement operation in this area." Sarah squared her shoulders. She knew the law. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Know your rights, or you have none." "Officer," Sarah said, reading the name tag on his vest. "Officer Vance. I am standing on a public sidewalk. I am not committing a crime. I am not acting suspiciously. You cannot demand my identification or proof of citizenship without reasonable suspicion that I am in the country illegally. Simply standing at a bus stop while black is not reasonable suspicion." Vance's face tightened. He wasn't used to being quoted case law by women at bus stops. He was used to fear. He was used to compliance. "I have broad authority to investigate immigration violations," Vance snapped, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "Now you can either produce a green card, a passport, or an ID, or we can do this the hard way." Sarah didn't back down. "I am a United States citizen born in Ohio. I don't carry my passport to the hospital. My driver's license is in my wallet, but I am under no legal obligation to show it to you for a consensual encounter. Are you detaining me?" The air between them crackled with tension. A young man walking his dog across the street stopped, sensing the trouble, and pulled out his phone. Vance noticed the witness but didn't care. He was committed now. His ego had taken the wheel. "Yes," Vance lied, his voice dropping to a growl. "I am detaining you. I have reason to believe you are a foreign national attempting to evade detection. Now show me ID or you're going in cuffs." Sarah looked him dead in the eye. "You are making a mistake, Officer Vance. A Fourth Amendment violation that is going to cost you dearly. I am the head nurse at Mercy General. This badge," she tapped her chest, "is government issued for medical clearance. But if you want to arrest an American citizen for waiting for the bus, you go right ahead, but you better be ready for what comes next." Vance didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. The pain shot up her shoulder, but she didn't scream. She gritted her teeth. "Turn around!" Vance shouted, playing to an audience that wasn't there trying to justify his aggression. "Stop resisting!" "I am not resisting," Sarah said clearly, speaking for the camera she hoped was watching, speaking for the young man across the street filming. "I am complying under duress. You are hurting my shoulder." Vance slapped the cuffs on her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. He marched her toward the SUV just as the number 42 bus turned the corner. Sarah watched it approach. She saw the driver, a man she waved to every morning, slow down and look with wide eyes as his regular passenger was shoved against the side of a law enforcement vehicle. She thought of her patients. Mr. Henderson needed his dressing changed at 8 a.m. sharp. The trauma bay needed her inventory check. She wasn't just losing her freedom, she was being stripped of her duty. "You have no idea what you're doing," Sarah said quietly as Vance patted her down, his hands searching her scrub pockets. He pulled out her phone and her wallet. "I'm doing my job," Vance retorted, opening the back door of the caged vehicle. "Maybe next time you'll cooperate instead of acting like a lawyer." He shoved her inside. The seat was hard plastic, designed to be uncomfortable. The cage mesh separated her from the front. Vance slammed the door, sealing her in. He walked around to the driver's seat, tossed her bag on the passenger seat, and started the engine. He didn't check her wallet. He didn't look at her ID. He was so convinced of his own intuition, so blinded by the profile he had constructed in his head, that he didn't bother to verify the very thing he had arrested her for. He picked up his radio. "Dispatch Unit 4 Alpha, 1 female in custody, non-cooperative, transporting to processing." Sarah sat in the back, her hands numb from the tight cuffs. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She controlled her heart rate. Panic was the enemy. Detail was her ally. She memorized the time, 7:22 a.m. She memorized the route he was taking. She listened to him humming along to the radio, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just kidnapped a U.S. citizen. She thought about her son Marcus, who was a corporate attorney in Chicago. She thought about the lectures she gave to student nurses about documentation. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. She would write this down. She would write every second of it down. The drive took 20 minutes. Vance drove aggressively, weaving through traffic using his siren simply to bypass red lights. When they pulled into the DHS processing center, Sarah felt a cold resolve settle over her bones. They had taken her dignity, but they would pay for it. Vance pulled into the sally port, the heavy garage doors rolling down behind them. He hauled Sarah out of the vehicle. Her shoulders ached, and her wrists were chafing, but she held her head high. He marched her into the intake area, a sterile room filled with fluorescent light and the smell of industrial cleaner and despair. There were other officers there drinking coffee, reviewing files. They looked up as Vance brought her in. Sarah saw the confusion in their eyes. They saw a woman in expensive nursing scrubs, well-groomed posture, perfect in handcuffs. It didn't fit the usual narrative. Vance shoved her toward the intake desk where a desk sergeant named Mike sat. Mike was 58, a 30-year veteran of Border Patrol and immigration. He had seen it all. He had tired eyes and a hairline that had retreated decades ago. He looked at Vance, then at Sarah. "What do we have here, Kyle?" Mike asked, his voice gravelly. "Subject refused to identify," Vance said, puffing out his chest. "Suspected illegal entry, resisting detention, possible visa overstay." Mike looked at Sarah. He saw the fire in her eyes, but also the calm. He saw the hospital badge. "Ma'am?" Mike asked. "I am Sarah Jenkins," she said clearly. "I am a United States citizen. I was kidnapped from a bus stop by this officer while on my way to work at Mercy General Hospital. I have my driver's license, my hospital credentials, and my voter registration card in my wallet, which Officer Vance seized but refused to look at." The room went silent. The hum of the computer fans seemed to get louder. Mike looked at Vance. "You didn't check her wallet?" Vance scoffed. "She was non-compliant, Mike. She started quoting the Fourth Amendment. You know the type. Usually means they're hiding something." Mike didn't answer. He reached for the plastic bag Vance had thrown on the counter. He opened it and pulled out Sarah's wallet. It was a nice wallet, leather well worn. He flipped it open. The first thing he saw was a California Real ID with a gold star in the corner. Sarah Louise Jenkins. Born Cleveland, Ohio. He pulled it out. He checked the hologram. It was real. He dug deeper. A folded paper, her voter registration card. A membership card for the American Nurses Association. A debit card from a major bank. Mike felt a pit open in his stomach. He looked up at Vance, his expression turning from weary to horrified. "Kyle," Mike said, his voice low. "Did you run her name?" "System was slow," Vance lied. "I figured I'd do it here." "She's American, you idiot," Mike whispered, but in the silence of the room it sounded like a shout. "She's not just a citizen. She's got a real ID. She's a head nurse." Vance's face went pale, then red. "She could be using fraudulent docs. The behavior was suspicious." "The behavior?" Sarah cut in. "You mean waiting for the bus, or asking you for your probable cause?" Mike stood up. He walked around the desk. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at Sarah. "Uncuff her. Now." Vance hesitated. "Sarge, if we uncuff her without processing—" "Uncuff her!" Mike roared. The sound bounced off the concrete walls. Vance fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking. He unlocked the cuffs. Sarah rubbed her wrists. There were deep red, angry marks where the metal had dug in. She didn't say thank you. She looked at Mike. "I want a supervisor. The field director. Now." "Ma'am, we can resolve this." Vance started. "You remain silent," Sarah commanded. She didn't shout, but her voice had the authority of a woman who told surgeons when to cut. Vance snapped his mouth shut. Mike was already on the phone. "Get the director down here. Yes, now. We have a situation. Capital S." The minutes that followed were excruciating for the officers. Sarah stood in the center of the room. She refused to sit. She refused water. She just stood there, rubbing her wrists, staring at the Great Seal of the United States on the wall. 5 minutes later, Field Director Thomas Reynolds burst through the doors. He was a man in a suit who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He took one look at Sarah, one look at the shame-faced Vance, and he knew. "Ms. Jenkins," Reynolds said, approaching her with his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I am Director Reynolds. I am incredibly sorry for this misunderstanding. We are going to get you a car to take you to work immediately. We will expunge the arrest record. This was a terrible mistake." Sarah looked at him. "Dad, a mistake is forgetting your keys, Director. This was a violation of my civil rights, false imprisonment, and assault. And I'm not going anywhere until I have copies of the incident report, the body cam footage log, and the dash cam footage preserved. Reynolds blinked. Ma'am, we can't release evidence without a subpoena. Then I suggest you prepare for one, Sarah said. Because my son is an attorney, and by the time I get to the hospital, he will have filed an emergency injunction to preserve every second of tape you have. If 1 minute of that footage goes missing, I will own this building. She turned to Vance. He was staring at his boots. Look at me, she said. Vance looked up. He looked like a child caught stealing. You saw a black woman, and you turned off your brain. You assumed I was less than you. You assumed I had no rights. You were wrong, and I am going to make sure you never wear a badge again. Sarah accepted the ride to the hospital, but not in a police car. She demanded a town car service billed to the agency. She arrived at work 2 hours late. She walked into the trauma unit. Her wrists bruised her spirit, furious. She worked her shift. She saved lives. And on her breaks, she documented everything. The lawsuit was filed 4 days later. Jenkins versus Vance et al. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a manifesto. It listed 7 constitutional violations. It cited Terry versus Ohio and United States versus Brignoni-Ponce. It demanded jury trial. The Department of Justice tried to settle immediately. They offered $500,000. Sarah's lawyer, a shark named David Sterling, who specialized in 1983 civil rights claims, laughed at them. My client was kidnapped by the federal government, Sterling told the press. She doesn't want $500,000. She wants justice. The video from the bystander across the street hit the internet the same week. It was titled, Nurse versus ICE. It showed Sarah dignified and calm being manhandled by Vance. It showed the moment the cuffs clicked. It showed the bus leaving. The views skyrocketed. 2 million, 5 million, 10 million. The comments section was a war zone, but the overwhelming sentiment was rage. People shared their own stories. Nurses posted photos of themselves in scrubs with the hashtag #NotSuspicious. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was brutal for the agency. Sterling subpoenaed Vance's disciplinary records. They found a pattern. Vance had stopped 42 people in the last year. 38 were Hispanic or black. Only 3 had resulted in valid arrests. The rest were catch-and-release harassment. He was a predator with a badge, and his supervisors had looked the other way because he met quotas. The agency had known. That was the key. They had known he was profiling, and they had promoted him. The trial took place 18 months later in a federal district court. The courtroom was packed. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table wearing her Sunday best, looking every inch the matriarch she was. Vance sat with the defense, looking smaller, younger, and terrified. When Sarah took the stand, you could hear a pin drop. She described the fear not for herself, but for the country. I was born here, she told the jury, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. My father fought for this country. I save American lives every day, and in that moment none of it mattered. To him, I was just a body to be processed. If it can happen to me in my uniform on my way to serve my community, it can happen to anyone. The defense tried to argue qualified immunity. They tried to argue that Vance made an honest mistake of fact. But the video destroyed them. The dash cam footage which Sarah had ensured was preserved showed Vance's aggressive approach. It recorded the audio clearly. It captured his sneer. It captured Sarah offering her ID and him refusing it. There was no mistake. It was willful. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a retired schoolteacher, read the verdict with a steady voice. They found for the plaintiff on all counts: unlawful seizure, excessive force, false arrest, violation of equal protection. Then came the numbers. Compensatory damages $1.8 million for the trauma, the injury to her wrists, and the violation of her rights. But it was the punitive damages that made the courtroom gasp. The jury wanted to send a message. They awarded $5 million in punitive damages against the agency and the officer personally, though the agency would indemnify him. Total verdict, $6.8 million. It was one of the largest individual awards for an unlawful stop in the district's history. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for nearly 2 years. It wasn't about the money. It was about the statement. The aftermath was swift. Kyle Vance was terminated 3 weeks after the verdict. The sheer size of the payout and the public embarrassment made him a liability the agency could no longer protect. He was stripped of his credentials and placed on a do-not-hire list for federal law enforcement. The last anyone heard, he was working construction in another state. But the victory went beyond one bad apple. As part of the post-trial injunctive relief, the agency was forced to overhaul its consensual encounter policies. They were required to implement mandatory training on implicit bias, specifically regarding the assumption of citizenship based on race. Sarah Jenkins returned to her life, but she was different. She was a hero to her neighbors, a legend in the hospital. She took the money, the $6.8 million, and she didn't buy a mansion. She didn't buy a luxury car. She established the Jenkins Legal Defense Fund for essential workers who had been targeted by law enforcement. She set up scholarships for minority nursing students at the local college. She ensured that her trauma became a ladder for others to climb. Years later, Sarah still waits at that same bus stop. She still wears her Navy scrubs. But now, when a police cruiser drives by, they slow down. The officers wave respectfully. They know who she is. They know that the woman standing there isn't just a nurse. She is a force of nature who reminded the United States government that the Constitution applies to everyone everywhere, even at a bus stop at 7:15 in the morning. This story is a reminder that freedom is fragile. It resides not in the paper of the Constitution, but in the courage of citizens willing to stand up and demand it be respected. Sarah Jenkins had the knowledge, the resources, and the will to fight back, but how many others don't? How many silent settlements are signed? How many apologies are never given? If this story moved you, if it made you angry or proud, I need you to do something. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been judged by authority figures based on how you look, and do you think the $6.8 million verdict was enough to teach the system a lesson? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories of the voiceless, the fighters, and the truth. Until next time, stay safe, know your rights, and never let them silence you.
Step away from the truck. Show me your papers right now.
I'm a U.S. citizen, retired Marine Major. You're getting my Arizona ID, not papers.
That license doesn't prove status. Turn around, hands on the tailgate, you're being detained.
If you cuff me without checking my passport card in that wallet, this becomes a federal lawsuit on camera.
Agent Kyle Vanner had been a field agent with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for just under 4 years when he made the decision that would end his career, humiliate his agency, and cost the federal government $7.9 million. He was 32 years old, ambitious and driven by a metric-focused mindset that prioritized arrest numbers over investigative due diligence. Vanner operated with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, believing his instincts were sharper than the law required. On a blistering Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona, those instincts led him to a busy grocery store parking lot, where he spotted a man he decided didn't belong. That man was Marcus Thorne, a 58-year-old retired Marine Corps major and a decorated combat veteran with a Silver Star. Thorne was a black man, a father, a grandfather, and a United States citizen born in Detroit, Michigan. What Vanner did next, ignoring Thorne's calm assertions of citizenship, refusing to look at valid identification, and shackling a man who had served his country for 3 decades, would become a definitive case study in how unchecked bias blinds law enforcement to reality. Before we get into the details of this case, tell us where you are watching from today. And if you believe that those who serve our country deserve better than to be treated like criminals in their own neighborhoods, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring these necessary stories to a wider audience. The setting was the sprawling parking lot of a Market Choice grocery center in North Phoenix. It is the sort of place that serves as a hub for the community, surrounded by hardware stores and strip malls, always packed with pickup trucks, SUVs, and sedans baking under the relentless Arizona sun. It was 11:30 a.m. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, creating shimmering waves of heat off the asphalt. The lot was busy with mid-morning shoppers, retirees, contractors on lunch breaks, and parents running errands while their children were in school. There was a rhythm to the place, the sound of shopping carts rattling over pavement and engines idling with air conditioners blasting. Marcus Thorne had arrived at the Market Choice at 11 a.m. He drove a pristine charcoal gray Ford F-150, a retirement gift to himself after leaving the Corps. Thorne was a man of routine and discipline. At 58, he kept himself in peak physical condition, his posture still carrying the ramrod straightness of an officer who had commanded battalions. He was dressed for the heat, but with his usual neatness, a navy blue polo shirt tucked into khaki cargo shorts and sturdy, well-worn work boots. He had spent 30 minutes inside the store picking up supplies for a home renovation project he was working on for his daughter, bottled water, heavy-duty trash bags, and cleaning supplies. He wasn't rushing. He moved with the deliberate, observant pace of a man who had spent a lifetime paying attention to his surroundings. Agent Kyle Vanner was patrolling the area in an unmarked SUV, though the vehicle was unmistakably law enforcement to anyone who looked closely tinted windows, extra antennas, and government plates. Vanner had been tasked with a routine surveillance sweep of a nearby construction site suspected of employing undocumented labor, but the site had been empty. Frustrated and empty-handed, Vanner decided to cruise the commercial lots looking for anything that fit his profile of suspicious activity. In Vanner's mind, the criteria for suspicion were fluid, often relying on gut feelings that he couldn't quite articulate in a report, but felt justified acting upon. He was looking for a win. He was looking for a stat. He parked his SUV in a shady spot near the exit of the Market Choice lot, scanning the rows of cars, waiting for something to catch his eye. He didn't know it yet, but he was on a collision course with a man who knew more about duty, honor, and the Constitution than Vanner would ever learn in his training manuals. The catalyst for the disaster that was about to unfold wasn't just Vanner's ambition. It was the incompetence of a second man. Derek Slayton was 29 years old, a private security guard hired by the property management company to deter shoplifters and keep the fire lanes clear. Slayton had applied to the police academy twice and had been rejected twice, once for failing the psychological evaluation and once for physical fitness issues. He wore his uniform, a polyester button-down with a generic security patch, with an air of self-importance that far exceeded his actual authority. He carried a flashlight, a radio that barely worked, and a deep-seated desire to be part of the real action. Slayton spent most of his shifts patrolling the lot in a golf cart looking for minor infractions he could blow out of proportion. From his vantage point near the cart return, Slayton watched Marcus Thorne exit the store. Thorne was pushing a heavy cart loaded with cases of water and large boxes. He reached his truck, unlocked the tailgate, and began loading the supplies. To a normal observer, this was a man buying groceries. To Derek Slayton, who was bored and eager to prove his worth, Thorne's behavior seemed off. Slayton watched as Thorne finished loading the truck, then walked around to the front, popped the hood, and pulled out a rag to check the oil dipstick. Thorne was meticulous about his vehicle. He checked his fluids every time he filled up or carried a heavy load. It was a habit from the motor pool, but Slayton interpreted this differently. In his mind, a man lingering by his truck looking under the hood in a parking lot wasn't maintaining his vehicle, he was waiting for someone. He was stalling. It looked like a drug drop, or maybe a pickup for human smuggling, a narrative Slayton had concocted entirely from cable news and his own imagination. Slayton spotted the black SUV with government plates idling in the shade. He recognized the type of vehicle immediately, seeing a chance to be useful to real law enforcement. Slayton drove his golf cart over to Vanner's window. He tapped on the glass. Vanner rolled the window down halfway, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Can I help you?" Vanner asked, his eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses. Slayton leaned in, conspiratorial and breathless. "I think I've got something for you, officer. There's a male subject over in row 4. Black male, late 50s. He's been loitering by that pickup truck for 20 minutes. Pretending to fix his engine, but he's keeping his head on a swivel. Looks like he's waiting for a drop. I've seen this kind of thing before." Slayton hadn't seen anything of the sort before, but he wanted to sound experienced. Vanner's interest was piqued. This was the lead he had been looking for. "Is he alone?" Vanner asked. "Solo," Slayton confirmed. "But he looks nervous. Big guy. Could be a runner." Vanner didn't ask for specifics. He didn't ask what evidence Slayton had beyond looking nervous. He didn't ask if the man had actually committed a crime. He heard suspicious black male and loitering, and his bias filled in the rest of the picture. "I'll check it out," Vanner said, putting the SUV into gear. "Thanks for the tip." Slayton beamed, feeling like he had just initiated a major bust. He drove his cart to a safe distance to watch the show, pulling out his personal cell phone to record, hoping to capture the takedown he had helped orchestrate. Vanner drove slowly down row 4, spotting the charcoal Ford F-150. Thorne had finished checking his oil and was wiping his hands on a shop rag. He closed the hood of the truck with a solid thud and walked around to the driver's side door. He was just reaching for the handle when Vanner's SUV pulled up diagonally behind him, blocking Thorne from backing out. It was an aggressive maneuver designed to intimidate and prevent flight. Thorne paused, hands still on the door handle, and turned to look at the vehicle. He didn't run. He didn't look panicked. He looked annoyed. He watched as the door of the SUV opened, and a man in a tactical vest with police ice emblazoned on the back stepped out. Thorne stood his ground. He had faced down insurgents in Fallujah and commanded men in life-or-death situations. A 32-year-old federal agent in a grocery store parking lot did not intimidate him. He assumed the officer was looking for someone else or needed to ask a question about the area. Thorne placed his hands visibly on his hips, a non-threatening posture, and waited. Vanner approached rapidly, one hand resting near his holstered sidearm, his body language screaming aggression. He didn't start with a greeting. He didn't introduce himself. He stopped 6 feet from Thorne and barked, "Step away from the vehicle." Thorne frowned slightly, but complied, taking a single step back. "Can I help you, officer?" Thorne asked, his voice deep and steady. Vanner ignored the question. He was scanning Thorne, looking for the nervousness Slayton had promised. He didn't see it, which only made him more suspicious. In Vanner's experience, people who weren't nervous around law enforcement were either innocent or seasoned criminals. Vanner had already decided Thorne wasn't innocent. "What are you doing here?" Vanner demanded. "I'm shopping," Thorne said, gesturing to the cart return where he had just left his buggy. "Just bought some supplies. Is there a problem?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this lot," Vanner said, using the vague catch-all phrase that allowed him to stop anyone he wanted. "Loitering. Potential trafficking." Thorne actually laughed a short, dry chuckle. "Trafficking, son, I'm buying water and bleach for a remodel. You can check the bed of the truck." Vanner bristled at the word son. He took a step closer, invading Thorne's personal space. "I need to see your papers," Vanner said. It was a specific choice of words. Not identification, not driver's license, but papers. It was a phrase loaded with implication, a phrase directed at someone Vanner assumed was not a citizen. Thorne's demeanor changed instantly. The amusement vanished, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a field officer. He recognized exactly what was happening. He had fought for the flag on Vanner's vest, and now that flag was being used to insult him. "My papers," Thorne repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "I am a United States citizen. I don't carry papers. I carry a driver's license." Vanner shook his head dismissively. "I need proof of citizenship. Passport, green card, or employment authorization. Now." "I am not a foreigner," Thorne stated clearly, articulating every syllable. I am a retired major in the United States Marine Corps. I am a citizen of this country. I have an Arizona driver's license in my pocket. That is all you are getting." Thorne moved his hand slowly toward his back pocket. "Don't reach!" Vanner shouted, his hand gripping the handle of his gun. Thorne froze. "I am reaching for my wallet," Thorne said calmly, "to show you the ID you asked for." "I didn't ask for a license," Vanner snapped. "I asked for proof of status. We have reason to believe you are in the country illegally." The accusation hung in the hot air between them. It was absurd. Thorne spoke unaccented American English. He was driving a late-model truck registered in his name. He was dressed like half the fathers in the parking lot. The only reason Vanner was questioning his status was the color of his skin. "Reason to believe based on what?" Thorne asked. "Based on the fact that I'm black and fixing my truck, is that your probable cause?" Vanner's face reddened. He wasn't used to suspects debating him. He was used to fear. He was used to compliance. "Based on information received," Vanner lied, doubling down on Slayton's baseless tip. "Now, are you going to provide documentation, or am I going to detain you for failure to identify and obstruction?" Thorne knew the law. He knew that in Arizona he was required to identify himself if lawfully detained, but he also knew that Vanner had no reasonable suspicion for the stop. However, Thorne was also a pragmatist. He knew that arguing on the side of the road with an agitated agent could get him killed. He decided to provide the ID confident that it would end the encounter, even though he was furious. "I am going to retrieve my wallet," Thorne announced again. "Slowly." Vanner didn't draw his gun, but he kept his hand on it. Thorne pulled out a brown leather bifold wallet. He flipped it open. Inside, visible in the window, was his Arizona driver's license. He held it out for Vanner to see. "Arizona driver's license. Valid. Issued to Marcus Thorne." Vanner glanced at it but didn't take it. "That doesn't prove citizenship," Vanner said. "Anyone can get a license." This was legally incorrect and practically nonsensical in this context, but Vanner was no longer operating on logic. He was operating on ego. He had challenged this man and he needed to win. "It proves I am who I say I am," Thorne said. "And if you run that name, you'll see I have no warrants and a clean record." "Now am I free to go?" Vanner sneered. "No, you're not. I suspect that license is fraudulent, and until I can verify your country of origin, you're not going anywhere." Vanner was digging a hole, and instead of climbing out, he was asking for a shovel. He looked around. A small crowd had started to gather. Shoppers were pausing, sensing the tension. Phones were coming out. A woman near a minivan was recording. A man in a work shirt was watching closely. Vanner felt the eyes on him. He needed to assert control. "Turn around and place your hands on the truck," Vanner ordered. Thorne stared at him. "You are making a mistake," Thorne said. "A very expensive mistake." "Turn around," Vanner shouted, unholstering his taser this time, pointing the yellow plastic weapon at Thorne's chest. The sight of the weapon caused a gasp from the bystanders. "He's not doing anything," a woman shouted from the sidewalk. "He showed you his ID." Vanner ignored the crowd. "Last warning, hands on the truck." Thorne looked at the taser, then at Vanner's eyes. He saw the panic and the pride warring in the younger man. Thorne knew that if he resisted physically, Vanner would pull the trigger and then likely claim Thorne had attacked him. The narrative would be lost. Thorne decided to win the war by losing this battle. He turned slowly and placed his large, calloused hands on the hot metal of his truck bed. "I am complying under duress," Thorne announced loud enough for the witnesses to hear. "I am a United States citizen being detained without cause." Vanner holstered the taser and grabbed Thorne's wrist, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. He slapped a handcuff on the left wrist, then grabbed the right. Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He stood like a statue, letting Vanner perform his theater of dominance. The cuffs clicked shut tight against the bone. Vanner patted Thorne down, roughly checking his pockets. He pulled the wallet out of Thorne's hand and shoved it into his own pocket without looking at it. "You're under arrest for suspicion of alien smuggling and resisting a federal agent," Vanner announced. "Check the wallet," Thorne said calmly, his cheek pressed against the side of his truck. "Behind the license, there is a U.S. passport card and a Department of Defense retired identification card. If you look at them, you can end this now." Vanner didn't look. He didn't want to look. If he looked and saw they were real, he would have to admit he was wrong in front of 20 people with cameras. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist or were fake until he got Thorne back to the station where he could control the narrative. "I'll process your evidence at the station," Vanner said. "High-quality fakes are common." Vanner spun Thorne around. The sight of the older man, dignified even in handcuffs, being manhandled by the younger agent struck a chord with the crowd. "This is shameful," an older man shouted. "That man is a veteran. Look at the sticker on his truck." Indeed, on the rear window of the F-150 was a decal USMC, Semper Fi, 2nd Battalion. Vanner ignored it. He marched Thorne toward the SUV. Thorne walked with his head up. He made eye contact with the woman recording on her phone. He nodded to her, a silent signal to keep filming. Vanner opened the back door of the SUV and pushed Thorne inside. The cage was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and plastic. Thorne sat awkwardly, his hands painful behind his back. Vanner slammed the door. As he walked around to the driver's seat, Vanner felt a surge of adrenaline. He had his suspect. He would find something. Maybe the truck was stolen. Maybe the ID was fake. He convinced himself that he was right, because he had to be right. He couldn't imagine a world where he had just arrested an innocent man based on nothing but prejudice. The drive to the Phoenix-on-CE field office took 20 minutes. Thorne spent the time memorizing details. He noted the time on the dashboard clock. He noted Vanner's speed. He noted the fact that Vanner never radioed in the stop to dispatch a violation of protocol. Thorne was building his case file in his head. He remained silent, refusing to give Vanner any more ammunition. Vanner glanced in the rearview mirror, occasionally expecting Thorne to beg or bargain. Thorne just looked out the window, watching the city pass by his face, a mask of resolve. When they arrived at the field office, Vanner pulled into the secure sally port. He helped Thorne out of the vehicle, though helped was a generous term for the way he yanked the older man by the arm. They walked into the processing area, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors. Several other agents were at their desks. They looked up as Vanner brought in his catch. Vanner was beaming slightly, projecting the image of an agent who had just taken down a major threat. "Processing one for failure to identify and suspicion of illegal entry," Vanner announced to the room. He guided Thorne to a metal bench and pushed him down. "Sit." Thorne sat. "I need my wallet," Thorne said. "It contains my federal identification." Vanner ignored him and walked over to the intake desk to start the paperwork. At that moment, the door to the inner offices opened and Assistant Special Agent in Charge Michael Reynolds walked out. Reynolds was 55 years old, a career law enforcement officer who had started in Border Patrol and worked his way up. He was tired, overworked, and had zero tolerance for incompetence. He held a mug of coffee in one hand and a file in the other. He glanced at the bench and stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't see a suspect. He saw a man who carried himself like a fellow officer. And then he looked closer. Reynolds walked over to the bench. He looked at Thorne. "Sir," Reynolds asked, "can I help you?" Thorne looked up. "I am Major Marcus Thorne, USMC retired. This agent arrested me in a parking lot while I was buying groceries. He has refused to verify my citizenship. My credentials are in my wallet, which is currently in his pocket." Reynolds turned slowly to look at Vanner, who was typing at a computer terminal. "Vanner," Reynolds said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Come here." Vanner looked up, surprised by the tone. He walked over. "Yeah, boss, just booking this guy. Refused to show papers." Reynolds held out his hand. "Give me the wallet." Vanner hesitated. "Boss, he claims he has ID, but you know how good the fakes are these days. Give me the wallet." Reynolds' voice echoed in the silent room. Vanner reached into his pocket and handed over the brown leather wallet. Reynolds opened it. He pulled out the Arizona license. He ran his thumb over the hologram. It was real. He flipped the flap. There, in the clear plastic sleeve, was a blue U.S. passport card, and behind it the distinct hard plastic ID of a retired military officer. Reynolds looked at the dates. He looked at the rank. He looked at the face in the photo, and then at the face of the man on the bench. Reynolds closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. He was watching a career-ending disaster unfold in real time. He turned to Vanner. "Agent Vanner," Reynolds said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you look at these?" Vanner shifted his weight. I glanced at the license, but he wouldn't answer questions about his birth country, so I assumed." "You assumed?" Reynolds cut him off. "You assumed that a man with a valid Arizona driver's license, a U.S. passport card, and a military ID was an illegal alien. Did you run his name?" "Not yet. I was just—" "You arrested a United States citizen. You arrested a decorated field-grade officer, and you brought him here in handcuffs without a single shred of probable cause." Reynolds turned back to Thorne. "Major Thorne," Reynolds said, his tone shifting to one of profound respect and apology. "I am incredibly sorry. This is a mistake. A terrible mistake." He pulled a key from his belt and immediately unlocked the handcuffs. Thorne rubbed his wrists. There were deep red indentations where the metal had dug in. "It is more than a mistake," Thorne said, standing up and towering over Vanner. "It is a violation of my civil rights. It is an assault, and it is a disgrace to the oath you all took." Reynolds turned to Vanner. "Badge and gun, now." Vanner's eyes went wide. "What, boss? I was just following a lead. You profiled a citizen, you ignored exculpatory evidence, and you violated agency policy and federal law. Put them on the desk. You are on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Get out of my building." Vanner, stunned and pale, unholstered his weapon and placed it on the desk. He unclipped his badge. He looked at Thorne, expecting maybe a moment of understanding, but found only a stone wall. He walked out of the processing room, his footsteps heavy in the silence. But the damage was already done. The videos from the parking lot were already online. By the time Thorne left the ICE office, driven home personally by Reynolds, the internet was on fire. The video showed everything. Thorne's calm compliance, Vanner's aggression, the refusal to look at ID. The caption, "ICE agent arrests black veteran for shopping," was trending globally. The backlash was immediate. Veterans organizations issued blistering statements. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund reached out to Thorne before he even got home. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later. It was a masterclass in civil litigation. It named Kyle Vanner, the Department of Homeland Security, the security firm that employed Derek Slayton and Market Choice for their negligent reporting policies. The complaint detailed counts of false imprisonment, assault, and battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and deprivation of rights under color of law. It highlighted the fact that Vanner had bypassed every protocol designed to prevent this exact situation. He had chosen bias over procedure. During the discovery phase, Vanner's personnel file was opened. It revealed a pattern of aggressive stops that had been flagged by previous supervisors but never acted upon. It showed that Vanner had a history of stopping Black and Latino men based on flimsy pretexts. It showed that the agency knew he was a liability and had left him on the street. The security guard, Derek Slayton, was deposed. He crumbled under questioning, admitting that he had no evidence of any crime, just a feeling that Thorne didn't belong. Market Choice settled quickly for an undisclosed amount and fired the security firm. Slayton was fired and blacklisted from the security industry, but the case against Vanner and the federal government went to trial. The government tried to argue qualified immunity, claiming Vanner made a reasonable mistake. The judge threw that argument out, citing the fact that Vanner had refused to look at the valid ID Thorne offered. A reasonable officer, the judge noted, checks ID before arresting someone for not having ID. The trial lasted 5 days. Thorne took the stand. He spoke about his service. He spoke about the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his neighbors. He spoke about the fear that he would be shot for reaching for his wallet. The jury, comprised of 8 women and 4 men, listened intently. They watched the video. They saw the arrogance of Vanner. They saw the dignity of Thorne. The verdict was unanimous. The jury found in favor of Marcus Thorne on all counts. They awarded him $2.9 million in compensatory damages for the trauma and reputational harm. But they didn't stop there. To send a message to the agency and to every officer who thinks a badge is a license to discriminate, they awarded an additional $5 million in punitive damages, a total of $7.9 million. Kyle Vanner was formally terminated. His name was added to the federal Do Not Hire list, effectively ending his career in law enforcement or government security. The agency announced a sweeping overhaul of its engagement protocols. A new policy dubbed the Thorne Rule was implemented, mandating that agents must verify all offered identification on site before any physical detainment can occur, barring an immediate threat to life. As we reflect on this story, we are left with a sobering reality. Marcus Thorne did everything right. He served his country. He followed the law. He remained calm in the face of aggression. And yet none of that protected him from the bias of one man with a badge. It took a lawsuit and a national outcry to restore his dignity. But what about those who aren't retired majors? What about those who don't have the resources to fight back? Freedom shouldn't be conditional on who is watching. It shouldn't depend on whether you have the right friends or the right rank. It should be absolute. Major Thorne fought for that freedom overseas only to have to fight for it again in a parking lot in Phoenix. We want to hear from you. Do you think the $7.9 million judgment was enough to change the culture of these agencies? And should officers like Kyle Vanner face personal financial liability for these civil rights violations? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story important, please share it. The more we shine a light on these injustices, the harder it becomes for them to hide in the shadows.